Imagine being 17 years old. You have never held a sword. You have never commanded a single soldier. You cannot read. You have spent your entire life in a small village in northeastern France, doing what peasant girls did, tending animals, spinning wool, learning prayers. And then, one morning, God speaks to you, not as a feeling, not as a vague spiritual impression, but as a voice, clear, insistent, real. And the voice tells you that you, specifically you, a girl from nowhere, must save France. That is where this story begins. Not in a palace, not in a war room, not with a king or a general. It begins in a field in Domremy, with a girl who has no power, no title, no military training, and no reason whatsoever to be believed. And yet, somehow, she will be believed. She will be given armor and an army. She will ride into battle and break a siege that had lasted for months. She will personally escort a cowardly, indecisive king to his own coronation, and she will do all of this before her 19th birthday. The France that Joan of Arc was born into, around 1412, was a country in the process of being erased. The 100 Years' War between France and England had been grinding on for the better part of a century, and by Joan's childhood it was going very badly for the French. The English, allied with the powerful Duchy of Burgundy, controlled Paris and nearly the entire north of the country. The French king, Charles VI, had actually signed a treaty declaring the English king the rightful heir to the French throne. When Charles VI died in 1422, his son, the man who would eventually become Charles VII, was left with a claim to a kingdom that was rapidly being swallowed by its enemies. His own legitimacy was under question. His treasury was nearly empty. His army had suffered devastating defeats. France, as a nation, was dangling by a thread. It was into this world that the voices came to Joan. She later described them as the voices of St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. They began when she was around 13 years old, soft at first, then louder, then impossible to ignore. By the time she was 16, they were giving her a specific mission: travel to the court of the Dauphin Charles, convince him to give her an army, and drive the English out of France. To any reasonable observer, this was an absurd proposition. Women did not lead armies. Peasant girls did not gain audiences with royalty. And yet Joan set out anyway. She had to convince a local lord named Robert de Baudricourt to provide her with an escort to the royal court. He refused her twice. The second time, he reportedly told her to go back to her father and have him box her ears. She came back a third time. He gave her the escort. When Joan arrived at the court of the Dauphin Charles in Chinon in February 1429, she walked into a room full of nobility, dressed in their finest, with Charles himself deliberately hidden among them in plain clothes to test her. According to the accounts that survive, she walked straight to him without hesitation. Whatever he said to her privately in that meeting, whatever she told him, and she claimed to have whispered a secret that only God could have known, the effect was dramatic. Charles, who had every reason to dismiss this girl as a fraud, a lunatic, or both, chose instead to take her seriously. He was not reckless about it. He sent her to be examined by a group of theologians in Poitiers, who questioned her extensively for several weeks. They found no fault in her. They could not explain her, but they could not condemn her either. Charles gave her armor. He gave her a banner. He gave her an army. And he sent her to Orléans. Orléans was the most important city still holding out against the English. It had been under siege since October 1428. If it fell, the road south would be open, and with it, the last real hope for a French resurgence would likely collapse. Joan arrived in late April 1429. She arrived not quietly, not as an observer, but as a force. She wrote a letter to the English commanders demanding they withdraw. They did not, of course. So she fought. In the space of 9 days, the siege of Orléans was lifted. 9 days. What seasoned French commanders had failed to accomplish in months, this teenager from Domremy achieved in just over a week. She fought at the front of her troops, not from the safety of the rear. She was struck by an arrow above her breast during one of the assaults, pulled it out herself, and returned to the battle. The English, who had mocked her in letters as the Armagnac whore, began to speak of her differently, with something that looked uncomfortably like fear. What followed was a streak of French victories that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Joan pushed for an aggressive campaign to the northeast, and the French army swept through English-held territory, winning battle after battle. By July 1429, Charles was riding to Reims, deep in territory that had been considered enemy ground, to be crowned King of France in the cathedral where French kings had been anointed for centuries. Joan stood beside him, holding her banner, having fulfilled in a matter of months what she had promised she would do. And then the story darkens. Charles, now king and now surrounded by advisors who found Joan inconvenient, grew cautious. He signed truces. He delayed. Joan, who believed the momentum had to be pressed, grew frustrated. In the spring of 1430, fighting without full royal support, she was captured by Burgundian forces near Compiègne and sold to the English. What followed was one of history's most grotesque legal proceedings. She was tried for heresy and witchcraft by a court that was, in everything but name, an English political operation. The man presiding over her trial, Bishop Pierre Cauchon, was thoroughly in the pocket of the English. The outcome was never really in question. Through months of interrogation, conducted without legal counsel, without support, surrounded by enemies, Joan held her ground with a sharpness that still startles anyone who reads the transcripts. When asked whether she knew she was in God's grace, a trap, because to say yes was arrogance, to say no was admission of guilt, she answered, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." The court did not know what to do with that answer. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. She was 19 years old. By all accounts, she died asking for a cross, looking into the fire, saying the name of Jesus. The English thought they had extinguished something. They had not. Within 2 decades, France had won the 100 Years' War. Charles VII, the timid, uncertain man Joan had dragged to his own coronation, eventually had her trial declared null and void. She was rehabilitated, vindicated, and in 1920 canonized as a saint. What Joan of Arc actually was, prophet, psychological phenomenon, genuine mystic, or something else entirely, is a question history has never fully resolved, and perhaps never will. What is not in question is what she did. At the moment France was closest to disappearing, a girl no one should have listened to made herself impossible to ignore. She walked into a war and bent it toward a different ending. And the country that exists today, with its borders, its language, its identity, exists in no small part because of 9 days in 1429 and the extraordinary, inexplicable girl who fought them. If this story moved you the way it deserves to, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. It means more than you might think, and it helps stories like this one reach the people who need to hear them.